Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 222 and I am the show's host Kyle. On today's episode, I have Will Porter joining me. Will Porter is a foreign policy analyst and writes on Mideast affairs. His work can be found at antiwar.com, consortiumnews.com, and also at libertarianinstitute.org. And of course, the Libertarian Institute is a place where you can find this podcast. So if you'd like to go out and share mine and Will's work, which we both really appreciate, you could go to libertarianinstitute.org. And my daily news roundup is there as well. Getting to today's show, I have Will on to discuss an event that's, well, they're comparing it to 9/11 and Pearl Harbor. And so at this point, Will, what I'm describing here must be absolutely catastrophic. What is it?
Yeah, I know. It's a true apocalyptic event. The leaders of two countries met and had a summit together. Donald Trump, the president of the United States, and Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia.
No, wait, they didn't launch nuclear weapons or sign a treaty ending all war?
Nope, they just had a meeting, just had a summit.
All right, so these two guys talked. And of course, me and Will are just joking around. We obviously watched it and know what we're talking about here, but it is just interesting how big the media overreaction and the congressional overreaction, and even almost like just now the consensus on the street. But Will, talking about this, I want to start off with actually what was happening the Friday before the summit. And as we had the Mueller probe, which is out there investigating Russiagate. If you want a live analysis on Russiagate, check out Foreign Policy Focus episodes 211 through 213, where I have Dan Wright and Joanne Leone on the show, and they're the hosts of the Around the Empire podcast. And they help me break down every aspect of Russiagate up until that point. However, I think there's kind of a new section to Russiagate now, and these are the most recent indictments against, I believe, 12 Russian GRU agents. So, Will, tell us all about this.
Yeah, sure. So this indictment, as you said, it's 12 Russian nationals who are alleged to be agents of what's called the GRU, or the Main Intelligence Directorate, which is sort of a military intelligence agency in Russia. Now, there's a number of charges that they're alleged to have committed, but the main one, I think, it's sort of broad. It's a conspiracy to commit an offense against the United States. And more specifically, actually, on page 6 of the indictment, the sort of the document laying it out, it says, the object of the conspiracy was to hack into the computers of U.S. persons and entities involved in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, steal documents from those computers, and stage releases of the stolen documents to interfere in the election. And so that's essentially what this indictment is saying. And there's other counts that have to do with identity theft and money laundering, but that is the basic gist of the indictment. Now, I think we should note, as you said, it was just the Friday before the summit. It was just like 3 days before Trump and Putin met to speak. And so I think you could see this indictment as like politically timed. There's sort of a political effect that's intended by it. And another thing to note, I think, is that, as you would expect, the Russian Foreign Ministry has come out and they've denied that any of the 12 individuals affiliated, or any of the 12 individuals named in the indictment have anything to do with the GRU. Now, I think you can sort of expect that they would do that, just sort of a generic denial. However, my editor over at Consortium News, Joe Loria, he talked to a retired CIA analyst named Larry Johnson. And Johnson was extremely skeptical that the Department of Justice or any American law enforcement agency would even be able to determine, who was or wasn't an agent of the GRU. And so he said this indictment likely had to rely on some kind of intelligence, some kind of like the NSA or something, signals intelligence. And he found it just sort of dubious that they would have the level of detail that the indictment claims. He found that implausible. So I think that's an important thing to note here too, is just like, how do they know what they claim to know in this document? A retired CIA analyst seems to be dubious that they could know these things. And another thing to note here, too, about this indictment is, like the prior indictment, there's no mention of collusion with any American officials or any people affiliated with the Trump campaign. And so, yeah, I think that's sort of the basic gist of this indictment.
Right. And I know I talked about this a little bit on Foreign Policy Focus 219, where I broke down a interview of Rand Paul by Jay Tapper, and they get into this a little bit. And I explained how, look, while everybody's saying these indictments prove that there was collusion between Trump or that Russia had the election, I suppose, there's no actual evidence in it. This is just an indictment. It's an allegation that a crime was committed. It's not a conviction. It's not proof. And this brings up another aspect, and that is if there is evidence, that evidence is likely very secret, and the Mueller would have a hard time proving this in court without either revealing the sources and the methods to obtain that intelligence or dropping the charges because they're not going to have evidence. And this seems to be a pretty consensus feeling here, is that the men indicted for these charges will never actually face trial in a U.S. court. If you talk to somebody on the left like Rachel Maddow, this is these people escaping justice. But if you talk to people who seem to be a little bit more well-informed on Russiagate and overall world happenings, they say, well, this has made it easy for Mueller to go ahead and make these indictments, knowing that he would never have to prove these charges in court.
Exactly. And I think that's exactly the case, because this is something that Larry Johnson himself said too, that like the indictment, typically in these indictment documents, they don't include information that's backed up by intelligence. Because if the defendant ever wanted to see his day in court and sort of challenge these things, that would force the American government to have to like bring sources and methods into the fore and have to reveal them. And so you could easily see this as sort of being like a poison pill. Like, this is a sign that it never will be tried in court, you know, that they're including this sort of intelligence stuff. It's really meant more for public consumption, I think.
And not to get too far ahead, this is something that Vladimir Putin even talks about in the summit press conference. He mentions that, there were indictments brought against a Russian company called the Internet Research Agency. And likewise, at the time, everybody kind of said, well, these indictments are never going to go to trial, so there's never going to be any justice. Well, the Internet Research Agency hired a lawyer, and that lawyer showed up to court and said, show me your evidence. And the Mueller investigation, not the defense, is now trying to delay the trial and the discovery of information. And so you would think that, like, if Vladimir Putin was really like the evil genius that they pretend that he is, then he would sacrifice one of his intelligence agents, have them go stand trial in the United States, and figure out a whole bunch of American state secrets.
Right, yeah, no doubt.
And it's like everybody's missing this. Like, the real sucker here, the real potential sucker here is Mueller, not Trump.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just like there's various things that indicate that this probe isn't really interested in obtaining results. It seems like a lot of the things they're doing are intended for more of a theatrical, political, display.
So, Will, I think the most detailed article I've seen on these indictments was one by Adam Carter. And I believe it ran on his website. I'll link to the article in the show notes page for those of you who either want to read it or go through it. But Will, it's pretty long. Do you want to just kind of summarize some of the highlights from that article?
Yeah, definitely. And Adam Carter is a great analyst who he's really more focused on like the technical aspects of things. Like, he's good at he's looked at some of the Guccifer 2.0 metadata and stuff. And so, yeah, the article you're referring to here is called Mueller's latest indictment contradicts evidence in the public domain. And that is published at his own site. I think it's like G-2. It's like his own blog. But then it's also running at Disobedient Media, where a lot of good stuff on this subject has been, reported and covered. So, just to summarize sort of Adam Carter's point in this piece, certain aspects of these new Mueller indictments rely on the Guccifer 2.0 publications from the summer of 2016. And now we've discussed, in detail, the Guccifer 2.0 guy and his publications, but he's alleged to be one of the Russian hackers who gave stolen material to WikiLeaks. That's the narrative about him. But there's a lot of problems with sort of how he relates to these indictments. So first of all, there's simply a matter of the timeline. And so on page 18 of this indictment, it says that Guccifer 2.0 didn't send WikiLeaks the Hillary Clinton emails until July 14th of 2016. Yet, Julian Assange, you can see he appears on a British TV show on June 12th, 2016, a full month before Guccifer is said to send him these emails. And Assange says that WikiLeaks possesses these Hillary Clinton emails that they have not yet published. And so that was well before that these indictments say that Guccifer sent these emails to Assange. So the timeline simply doesn't match there. And not only is it before Guccifer is said to have sent the documents, it's before Guccifer and Assange are even said to have made contact with each other. And so Assange is saying he has this information already by June 12th of 2016. So there's a major timeline issue there that simply the indictment, of course, ignores the fact that Assange was saying publicly that he had this information much earlier than they allege. Now, there's another issue. If, as this indictment claims, they claim if WikiLeaks only obtained these documents on July 14th, that does not give them enough time to vet them and to sort of do their authentication process to publish them on July 22nd, which is the date that WikiLeaks did publish those emails. we're talking about tens of thousands of documents here. And so giving them, they would have, based on the indictments timeline, WikiLeaks would have had 8 days to do all that verification. And that is really not enough time to do that.
And for the record, WikiLeaks has, I believe, never published a fake document. And so these are not hacks. And I know the WikiLeaks has been really demonized, and so people probably don't think the agency has high standards, but they really do. And they're probably more accurate than pretty much any other outlet.
That's exactly the next point I was going to make. I was going to say that, note that WikiLeaks has never been shown to have published anything but stuff that's 100% authentic, and so they have to have some kind of vetting process. And, they've published, tens of thousands of documents related to the DNC and Hillary and the Podestas, and none of that has ever been shown to be fabricated or doctored. And none of anything they've ever published has been shown to be such. And so, yeah, WikiLeaks has a significant vetting process, and something tells me that 8 days is not enough to vet 20 or 30,000 documents. And so there's another issue that the probe simply, or the indictment simply runs into a timeline problem. I'll let you respond, but there's other stuff that, there's other stuff to get into about Guccifer, though.
Well, I think this is a good time while we're on the tangent to just remind everyone that these emails are authentic. And so for the past 2 years, the FBI has been focused on trying to expose Russia tampering in the U.S. election when WikiLeaks released emails that proved the Democrats rigged their own, process. And Donna Brazile cheated in the debates, and this should be a huge affront to the American democracy. I mean, the opponent was Donald Trump, so really, it should have been, the DNC race should have been the race for the presidency. But, it didn't end up going that way. But they stole that election, and those emails are authentic. And yet, this isn't part of the scandal at all.
Right. I think one of the things that, I think the Russiagate people would come across as a lot more plausible if they would acknowledge sort of that, yes, the stuff that was in the Hillary emails was authentic and sort of meaningful. Whereas they just sort of want to ignore that entirely and just say it, they just want to point at the alleged source of these documents, that it was the Russians. And I don't know, they just never want to acknowledge that, these emails had some important stuff in them, and it was all authentic.
Right, and how it could be an attack on our democracy to expose information about one of the candidates. I mean, this is kind of like Cornerstone American. And I know it does get a little complicated when it's a foreign actor doing it. However, it does seem that, you have to say that it's a bigger deal that somebody rigged an election than somebody exposed information and maybe affected a later one because that information was so damning about one of the candidates.
Right.
I know this is a different scenario, but it's some white hat, hacker, maybe gets into the emails of a local politician and exposes maybe, child pornography or some kind of other crime. And then that guy is voted out of office. Well, the hacker did influence the election. It did do something illegal, but isn't it a hell of a lot worse that, the person was doing something terrible? And at the end of the day, isn't it good that information was exposed?
Right. Is that influence any different than the way that journalists influence people, public opinion, by releasing information and leaking, you know what I mean? It's the same kind of principle. Now, it'd be an entirely different thing if the information was false, leaking it, false fabricated information that a guy's a pedophile or something. Now we're talking about some real sadistic, criminal stuff. If the Russians had done something like that, whoa, boy, that's real, that would be real ominous. But, this is all giving them way too much anyway, because we don't have any proof that it was Russians in the first place.
Right. All right. So back to the article. Is there anything else you want to mention, Will?
Yeah. I just wanted to sort of get into, so the first problem with the, Adam Carter's, his thesis here, the first problem with the indictments are that there's a timeline issue, that majorly sticks out. But just sort of on a broader level, there's all kinds of problems with the Guccifer 2.0 publications. And the indictments sort of rely on the official narrative of the Guccifer 2.0 publications. They rely on that being true. And we have a lot of reasons, there've been a lot of, independent analysis by experts who've looked at the metadata on those documents and shown that, there's a lot of problems with them. So, for example, the metadata seems to indicate, several analysts agree with this, that these documents were more likely leaked from the inside instead of hacked. And so that's strikes a major blow to the entire, narrative of Russiagate. Not to mention there's these suspicious, what have been called Russian fingerprints in these documents and stuff. And so, there's a lot of really suspicious, shoddy sort of things associated with the Guccifer 2.0 publications. And if the indictments rely on them as evidence or rely on them as part of their narrative or their timeline, then those problems have to transfer over into the indictments themselves, I would say. And so I would say that's sort of the basic thesis of Adam Carter's piece. He gets into extreme detail backing up what he's saying, and I recommend your listeners go and actually read the piece, but that's sort of the gist of it.
This may be a good time to bring up that Scott Horton and Peter Van Buren put out an episode on the Scott Horton Show about the summit, and they kind of get into some of the same things that me and Will are getting into on this show. But Peter, I think, makes a very good point, and that is, what if the Russians were really doing this grand covert conspiracy where they were hacking into Hillary's emails and then planning to expose those emails to try to prevent her from becoming president of the United States? Wouldn't they have try to go through more third parties and really make it harder to, have a direct connection to Russia rather than using 12 GRU agents, 12 agents of the Kremlin? It seems too easy.
Yeah, I mean, you would think, I think Van Buren even says this, why wouldn't you go find, some Israeli hacker on the dark web or something and, have, several cutouts, several layers of deniability? Why would you have your own, I don't know, this, Peter Van Buren is speaking as someone who's a, several decade veteran of the State Department. Now, I don't think he has much experience directly with intelligence, but I think this is a guy who kind of knows how things work, who's been around the block, and he's not at all convinced that this even is plausible as a, intelligence operation.
Another thing, Peter and Scott get into, Will, is really the politics of the whole thing, and that this was probably a big power play by Robert Mueller here to really undermine, Trump's talks with Putin and also make it very difficult, I imagine, for Trump to, they're talking about indicting Rod Rosenstein or ending the probe. So let's talk about the politics really quick, because this is a huge indictment claiming that the Russians hacked the U.S. election, and this ended up helping Donald Trump to get elected 3 days before Donald Trump had a, groundbreaking summit with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, I would definitely say that. I think at this point, more than any, Stormy Daniels or any Democrat right now, I think Mueller has the most power over Trump right now. He has the most potential to do damage to Donald Trump. I think what he decides and what he does in this probe is really substantial, and it really sort of can influence a lot of, the way the media attacks him, the sort of the tact they take. And so I think Mueller has a lot of power right now, and I think we saw him wield that, what was it, last Friday with the indictments.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think this is probably, Mueller trying to exert his authority here. And I also think this probably made, a lot of the deep state actors who, find purpose in their lives by having this grand conflict between the United States and Russia. And then, of course, there's, the $1 trillion nuclear weapons upgrade that is probably going to cost $3 trillion by the time they're done with it. And so there's a lot of money at stake here, and I'm sure a lot of people are happy having anything possible to undermine these talks between Trump and Putin. Because the worst thing in the world for all of them is that, they have to go get jobs because Trump and Putin shake hands and say, we're going to start getting rid of all of our nukes because we really don't need this many. And what are these weapons of genocide for anyways? We can figure our stuff out.
Right. I mean, it's not even just there's a giant $1 trillion nuclear industry. There's Honeywell. There's all the, companies associated with that. They definitely have a stake in sort of maintaining hostility and, bad relations with Russia. But it's not just the arms manufacturers. It's all the think tanks. It's so many journalists. It's all these people at the Atlantic Council. Like you're saying here, a lot of jobs rely on this sort of atmosphere of hostility with Russia. And so that's definitely a major, a confluence of interests, all the people who rely financially on this being an outstanding issue.
All right. Well, do you have anything else to add on the Mueller indictments here?
No, I think that's it.
All right. So this is Friday. Over the weekend, I think the story from, my ability to, read headlines on Twitter and watch the news, I can't take much of the mainstream media, but I try to do a little. And there seemed to be mainly talking about a demand for Trump to cancel the summit, a demand for Congress to take action here. There's a lot of complaints that Trump is about to treat his enemy Vladimir Putin better than his allies and like Angela Merkel. And then, this leads us to the summit on Monday, which ends up happening. Trump ends up going through with it. Will, do you have any thoughts about, kind of what occurred over the weekend? And if not, just kind of go right into what your thoughts on the summit are.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the media reaction was obviously just way blown out of proportion. So I think that's just like a major facet of all this. But just in terms of maybe some of the substantial things in the summit that I think that occurred, I think there was a bit of discussion of sort of coordination between the U.S. and Russian militaries in Syria. That sounds like a, good development because we've seen a lot of things, I think the Americans even killed Russian mercenaries in Syria a few months back, I believe. So, things have gotten very close to outright hostility there. Let's see. I think Putin and Macron actually in a separate meeting had agreed on some joint effort to get humanitarian aid into Syria. And I believe Putin talked to Trump about that. And so I think there was some movement there. But in terms of of what we know of what was talked about, I don't know if there was that much of substance that was really hammered out here. However, I think the overall sort of my broad takeaway from it is a good thing. It's that it was a positive. I think despite what the media might want from this summit, I think relations improved in some incremental way between the U.S. and Russia after the summit.
Right. And I have a few thoughts on the summit. Putin describes the summit as successful and fruitful. Donald Trump calls it open and deeply productive. So, it sounds good from that angle. Trump, in his, kind of introductory statement said that there's no reason at all for U.S. and Russian relations to be at their low. And I think both leaders agree that relations between the United States and Russia, including the USSR going back to World War II, are now at an all-time low. Now, we could argue if that's true or not, but they're obviously very bad. I mean, if you look at what happened post Salisbury poisoning, the United States kicked 50 Russian diplomats out of the United States, more than ever happened at one time than under the Cold War. So relations are very bad. However, these two leaders are able to sit down and, I think that's very important that they're able to talk. And Donald Trump says now that relations are improving. I think he makes a powerful point when he says relations don't have to be this bad. I mean, if you look what's happening in Syria, we all want to fight the jihadists, yet we can't seem to get along. So that always has been absolutely crazy to me. In other areas of the world, I don't think we're quite as far apart as people like to say. I think some of the important topics that Putin brought up were expanding the START treaty that limits, I believe, nuclear weapons past 2021. He wants to re-enter into the INF treaty. He wants to work on a treaty for no weapons in space. I think this is very important because if there's now a space race for weapons, this is just going to bankrupt probably the whole planet. It'll be insane. And talk about anti-missile defense systems. I figure that one was probably pretty upsetting to the weapons makers because those anti-missile defense systems the United States keeps building are just massive boondoggles where they're able to, get so much money for research and development and just really steal from the taxpayer pretty open-handedly there. Yeah. Other subjects mentioned, like Will said, Syria. Both leaders, I think, vaguely mentioned Crimea. However, I thought their statements on it were positive and that they were both like, well, we disagree on it, but, we understand that the other side has a different position. And that's a really important thing. If the United States wants to continue to contest, the Russian, what they would call occupation of the Crimean Peninsula, what the Russians would call annexation after the Crimeans voted to join Russia, two different sides of that story. But as long as this doesn't have to destroy the rest of the relationship, I think is the key thing. Whereas the rest of the foreign policy establishment would like this to continue to be kind of a cornerstone, like how they had long said that the North Koreans must denuclearize before the U.S. engages in talks. It's a poison pill to ever having talks. And so if they demand that Russia must give Crimea back to the Ukraine before the United States will enter into talks with Russia, then talks can never happen. However, if they can have agree to disagree, at least they could work on other things like Syria and nuclear weapons. Both leaders talked about, nuclear weapons treaties, which was great.
Can I jump in?
And then there's a lot of, economic talk as well that I think is, less important for this show.
Right, right. Yeah, on the Crimea question, I think Trump sort of his answer here, or I think Putin actually answered the question, but sort of implicated Trump in it. But I think it actually works out for, our side. Cause, essentially, as you said, like they're basically agreeing to disagree about it. Putin answered the question, cause I think the reporter asked Putin, what was Donald Trump's position on the Crimea, on your taking it? And he said, Trump still maintains the position that the annexation was illegal or whatever, but we're going to work it out. And I think that's actually sort of the best of both worlds. It sort of appeases like the other side in a certain way by saying, oh yeah, it was illegal, but he's not making it this gigantic issue that's going to ruin the whole relationship. And so it's almost like, they can't say that he's denying it as an issue, but I don't know. So I just think he sort of freezes it in a good way there.
Right, and I mean, I learned something interesting a couple weeks ago. Apparently there's islands disputed between the United States and Canada. And, the United States will occasionally sail a U.S. flagship through. Canada will. But guess what? We get along and we trade and we're not trying to nuke each other. So, you can have disputes and put them in their own places. And, right. That will allow, you to move on and have fruitful discussions in other places.
Right, it's just about the context, like everyone just assumes this context that any dispute between the U.S. and Russia has to be this hostile, thing full of enmity and full of, the potential for war and stuff. Whereas, like, why can't it just be like our dispute with Canada, just like it's a bureaucratic thing. We figure it out through our institutions and we're a great democracy. We can handle these kind of issues. It's not like it threatens, it's so threatening to us.
All right. Well, do you have any other thoughts on, kind of the statements by the leaders in the summit itself?
Yeah, there was one thing I wanted to just sort of give Trump credit for. Now, I think it was a Reuters reporter who asked Trump, do you hold Russia accountable for anything? And people hated Trump's answer to this, but I liked it. He says, no, both sides are to blame. We've both made mistakes. He says something about, the Russiagate narrative has had a negative impact on the relationship between the two largest nuclear powers in the world, and he says it's ridiculous. And so I give him credit here. He's saying that he's taking some blame for the United States. He didn't say anything specific. He didn't refer to, America's role in the Ukrainian coup or America's role in scrapping the, anti-ballistic missile treaty or anything. But nonetheless, he is sort of implicitly taking credit for some of the mistakes and some of the, errors in our policies. And so I thought that was good. Of course, people are taking that just to be like, oh my God, moral equivalency between the evil Russians and the great United States. But yeah, he should, I'm not down with American exceptionalism. I think we should have more of a equivalent view.
Yeah, well, this is kind of the amazing thing is that nobody in the media could see this for whatever reason on Russiagate. And we saw this when Jay Tapper was interviewing Rand Paul. And Rand was like, well, America is interfered in elections too. And Jay Tapper was like, are you saying the Americans and the Russians are equivalent? And Rand was saying, no, but we both do it. So, let's talk about that as well. We can't ignore the fact that the U.S. meddled in Ukraine and in Russian elections. They both happened. Maybe, from even what seems Rand Paul's perspective, the Russians maybe did it more successfully. We can't deny that the Americans have done it as well. But every time they just jump to, are you saying the two sides are absolutely the same just because the Americans once did something that the Russians did?
Right. I mean, I would even go further with it. I would even say, okay, if we're just talking about the Russian Federation here since the fall of the USSR, let's not, if we're not talking about all the insane crimes of the Soviet Union, but just comparing the last few decades, well, no, there's not a moral equivalence between the US and Russia, and the United States is actually way on the worst side in terms of, overthrowing people's countries and governments and slaughtering civilians and stuff. Yeah, there's no equivalence. It's the United States with a giant global empire, not the Russians. And so I would go the other way with it, but that's, maybe beside the point.
All right, so let's get into the reaction of this summit. Well, because this is kind of where we led off the show, talking about how people are, talking about having to flee Alaska, or this is a Pearl Harbor style event, 9/11. It's really, they're saying this is a catastrophic event. They've compared it to genocidal situation. They really think that this is, I guess, the end of the world by Trump meeting Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, I guess so. I saw someone I forget who it was, referring to this as like crystal knocked. Like the time when, like, a bunch of German citizens went and, like, it was like an anti-Jewish pogrom in Nazi Germany. Yeah, that was kind of like this international meeting, kind of like Kristallnacht. Like, I don't see what I honestly cannot see what the hysteria is for here. What happened? What's different? What did we do? What has actually changed about reality after this summit? Trump basically, took the same positions he's been taking. We all know that he questions collusion. We all know that he doesn't believe there's collusion. The fact that he just said it with Putin right next to him makes it more, egregious or something? Like, I just don't see, of course I understand why they're doing it. They're taking every opportunity to attack the president they possibly can. But if we're talking on a realistic basis, like, no, there's really no grounds for this.
Right. And the bad part about it is it seems to have kind of crystallized in the minds of the Americans that this summit is somehow a bad thing. And not a good thing that the leaders, you had two men sitting there who control like 90 to 95% of the world's nuclear weapons, the weapons that could end the world. And rather than any of the journalists bothering to ask them, at least the American journalists, about the nuclear weapons issue, they go right towards the Russiagate stuff. So do you want to talk about that a little bit, just what the questions were?
Yeah. I mean, you had some of these questions were outrageous. We were laughing about this before we went on air. One of the guys, like, I think it was the Reuters reporter, basically just asking Trump, like, will you denounce Putin as an a-hole right here on stage to his face? And, that was basically the level of the questioning. You had I think you had a Russia Today or an RT reporter ask a pretty good one about, what are you guys doing to, reconcile in Syria? What are you doing to cooperate more in Syria? But it seemed like the tenor of the questions was like trying to get Trump to, like, take these theatrical positions, to have him, like, it's not even about any kind of substance. It's just about making him say things that you want him to say, like about making him go through these motions. That seemed to be the press's, main purpose here, is getting him to recite certain things.
Right. Well, they wanted him to call Vladimir Putin a liar to his face. Vladimir Putin was saying right next to him, and they were saying, Mr. President, Vladimir Putin told you this, your intelligence agencies. And in fact, I believe the AP journalist actually cited the redacted New York Times story that said all 16 or 17 intelligence agencies agreed, when really the report was just the hand-picked analyst of the CIA, NSA, and FBI, I believe. Or was it the DIA? One of those two. Anyways, the question wasn't even framed right, but he wanted Donald Trump to call Vladimir Putin a liar to his face. And I mean, this just isn't good tact anyways. Like, of course Donald Trump isn't going to say that right next to Vladimir Putin. Why? So they could get in a shouting match with each other there? This isn't what we want, right? We're not trying to, like, spark conflict between the two presidents of the world's largest nuclear powers. It's like they're game show hosts rather than actual journalists.
Right, I mean, exactly. And it's like, would anyone even if this Reuters or AP reporter got Trump to go through the motions and say this, does anyone really think he believes that? We've all heard what Trump says. We all know what he thinks about this. He thinks there was no collusion and blah, blah, blah. And so it's really just a matter of getting him to go through these motions and just do the, the empty actions themselves. Like, that matters more than the actual substance here. However, getting to one of the other questions that Reuters, I believe, asked Putin, and I think that his answer was extremely important, and that it really takes a lot of the wind out of the sails of the accusations against him. And so the question to Putin was, will you extradite the 12 GRU employees named in the Mueller indictments? And Putin says that, you expected him maybe to give this very evasive answer or something, but he says, look, the U.S. and Russia have a 1999 treaty on mutual legal assistance, and that it establishes procedures for this kind of thing. Exactly. And, all Mueller has to do is submit his request to our agencies, and we'll figure out how to interrogate these guys. And hey, we'll even let Mueller and the FBI or the DOJ guys, watch us interrogate. We'll even let them be present for it. As long as Russia is granted the same thing, the same courtesy, that there's Russians in America who are accused of breaking Russian law, let us talk to them, or let us be present when you guys talk to them. And so I thought that, like, I don't know if the media is going to really cover that very thoroughly, because that's a crazy offer, I think. Like, I wonder if Mueller would ever take Putin up on that offer.
And so another point that Peter Van Buren made on the Scott Horton show that I thought was very interesting is that even if this did happen as claimed, this would be like kind of normal activity, kind of covert spy activity that occurs between states. And so if the United States solution is to start indicting and charging the other side with it, then I don't think that's probably going to be a very good solution here to, like I said, somewhat normal, even if it's unfortunate, covert activity, just because then the United States is always going to be demanding that all these countries, extradite their intelligence officers to the United States. And when they don't do it, then we're gonna, protest, I think. That'll be the problem, is that we'll start to sanction and freeze relationships with all these other countries. And this is just gonna be another way to kind of, propagandize the American people of the evils of our, so-called enemies.
Right, that's an important thing to understand too. I think a lot of people are just missing context of like a lot of people just don't know how routine a lot of this intelligence stuff is and how every country does this. So, if you don't know about any of that and you're only presented one selective little piece of it and it's like made to seem like, oh my God, look at this big, it's a big deal, it's a big story. That, I don't know, you can see how you can easily sort of manipulate people like that. Instead of, if you knew the scope of the Israeli and Saudi and American and all these, British, all these different intelligence agencies, what they're doing in each other's countries and how they're interfering with each other's systems, I bet it would be far less ominous, the Russian one specifically.
Yeah, it's certainly not impossible that Russian intelligence, hacked Hillary Clinton's bathroom email server or hacked other, insecure, DNC servers or Podesta's emails, which are apparently very easy to get. I mean, the guy got phished, in something that definitely shouldn't happen to somebody in his position. So I suppose it's not impossible that the Russians didn't have the emails. The main thing is that they didn't collude with the Trump administration on it, and it doesn't seem that they were the ones who released those emails to WikiLeaks. Hell, the Israelis, the Chinese, even the British may have Hillary Clinton's emails. Probably everybody but the American people. But that doesn't necessarily, mean that the Russians passed those emails to WikiLeaks. In fact, if you look at kind of the situation in, let's say, June, July of 2016, everybody was positive that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. And so why the hell would, Vladimir Putin have Hillary Clinton's emails and decide to, release them during the campaign that she was going to win anyways to further upset her? It seems like if, his move would have been better to just, use the emails to try to blackmail Hillary Clinton like they claim he did with Donald Trump in the P-tape.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think, we can say, we don't know for a fact if it was the Russians. It's not implausible to suggest that they may have done so. That's one point. But I believe it's also important to point out that, the positive evidence that the accusers are giving us doesn't back up their allegations, So, I wouldn't even get, if we're being, we're being honest and we're being, good about it, having integrity and saying, we could be wrong, the Russians could have done it. But, I feel like that's almost giving them too much because, their whole claim that the Russians did this is based on shoddy evidence in the first place. So, I feel like, I don't know, there's very many layers to sort of, parse this.
Yeah, I see your point. I'm just saying that if Hillary Clinton's emails were on a unsecure server, I would be surprised if Russian intelligence didn't try to get their hands on them.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
It seems like too easy of a target, I guess, for them to have passed up.
Definitely.
All right, so is there anything else from the Q&A section that you found interesting, Will?
I don't think so. I think that, there's one part where Trump brings up, let me see, what was the question to him? To Trump, Putin denies hacking over the claims of the U.S. intelligence community. Who do you believe? So this is a question to Trump. And Trump sort of just challenges the entire narrative about the hacking thing by bringing up the fact that the FBI didn't have access to the DNC servers. So I thought that was important because that still has never really been acknowledged or resolved. That the FBI never looked at the DNC servers. It was only ever CrowdStrike. However, because Trump, because he's kind of a bad speaker, he screwed himself up here. He also brought up the missing 30,000 emails from Hillary Clinton's private server. And so that just allowed the press to just conflate those two things and dismiss it all. You know what I mean?
Right. Sometimes I wonder if it's, Trump's idea is that if he says something that sounds wrong or that, they're able to distort as being wrong, then they'll make a whole big deal out of it. Then he could just explain himself later. And so sometimes I think that's not him necessarily being a bad communicator. I think it's maybe a trick of his. Or he's a bad communicator. I don't want to give him too much credit. I'm just saying.
Right. No, I think I know what you're talking about. I noticed where he sort of purposely maintains something vaguely so he can later say, that's not what I meant. But here, I think he just sort of he shot himself in the foot because he could have made a really good point about the DNC servers and how, why did the FBI never look at that? That's pretty important, right? Why did CrowdStrike only look at these servers? But then he went and shot himself in the foot by also mentioning the missing 30,000 Hillary emails, which the press just goes, oh, come on, that's just a talking point from the election that, he conflated the two things. And so he kind of, I don't know.
Right. And the last part about the Q&A I want to bring up is that there was kind of an interesting event that happened during the Q&A, and that is a journalist who was at first called a protester was removed from the press conference somewhat forcefully and then detained by Finnish police. But this guy turns out to be Sam Husseini, who is a journalist, and he was holding up a question about like a nuclear weapons treaty ban, and he's saying that he actually wasn't a protester, but just trying to get a question. And man, it stinks that they didn't ask him a question, because he could have talked about nuclear weapons rather than this silly, Russiagate stuff, trying to get Donald Trump to say something bad about Vladimir Putin to his face. So I just want to bring that up, because I think the consensus is still that, there was just some like crazy protester in there, but really it was a journalist just trying to ask a good question.
Yeah, it really is unfortunate, man, that there was no really, like, there was the RT reporter who had a pretty good, like, neutral question, but like, there could have been a reporter in there really asking, like, enthusiastically, like, come on, like, what did you guys, like, what are you agreeing about? Like, what do you, like, could have made it like a really conciliatory atmosphere between everyone, like, oh, we're all getting along here, and like, tell us what you talked about. Instead, they made it very sort of a hostile atmosphere where, like, it's them versus us. And I don't know. I just think it was a very poor performance. I really wish Sam Husseini could have asked his question about, nukes or whatever.
Yeah, it's somebody I wish could have asked, like, you guys talked about wanting to, like, increase world peace. Tell us, like, one thing you talked about that you think is going to make the world a better place.
Right. Like, we're all really excited to hear why Russia and the United States are getting along. Like, that kind of atmosphere. Like, encourage them, man. Like, make Trump feel like he's, like, doing the right thing and feels like, when he's getting along with Russia. But instead, they're doing the opposite. They're making the pressure completely against him.
One of the positive themes I took away from this, Will, was Trump trying to categorize Vladimir Putin and I guess Russia as a competitor rather than an adversary. And explaining that, yeah, the United States and Russia both export a lot of liquefied natural gas. And that means that, there's going to be some challenges. The United States wants Germany to buy our liquefied natural gas. Russia wants Germany to buy theirs. And so this is going to set us at odds at time. But this doesn't necessarily have to mean that we're ultimately our adversaries who just want to wipe each other off the face of the map.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to frame it too. Like sort of in the economic sense, like we're competitors. A competitor doesn't necessarily want to murder, his opponents. It's not his enemy or anything. And so that's definitely a much better way. Like compared to a lot of other GOP hawks, dude, they don't say, Russia's just a competitor. They will say they're an enemy or an adversary. And so that's very welcomed sort of, it's just language, but it's welcomed language from Trump.
Right. And I think that's like a kind of narrative that people could grasp onto and Trump supporters could actually explain. Because, what me and you are talking about in today's show, Will, we spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours researching and reading to understand these kinds of things, but most people don't have the time for it. So if Donald Trump could go out there and just say, Russia's not an adversary anymore, they're a competitor, that, means we're not friends like we are with the, British or the Germans or the Canadians, but, they're just a competitor, maybe, like a country that, we're just not in great relations with, but it's not that big of a deal. And so, I think that's a really positive step forward in a relationship that has been very frozen and very terrible, thanks, mostly to the foreign policy establishment, Hillary Clinton and John Bolton being the absolute best examples.
Yeah, no doubt. And now we can only hope that Trump, that sort of maybe some of this momentum, like maybe he'll see, although I'm kind of not, I'm not very confident that he'll see, that he's going to be cheerled or given praise for all, getting along with Russia. But I'm hoping something will embolden him to get along with other countries and make this sort of like a pattern. He needs to do it with Iran next, really. He needs to figure out how to get along. However, another thing though, I think this was addressed during the press conference. Apparently, Putin and Netanyahu are making deals, pertaining to Syria. Sort of keeping forces aligned, like, keeping Israel in its country and keeping Syria, out of the Golan. And, apparently in exchange for Iran going away. And so, speaking of Iran, I think there might be developments there that come out of the summit.
Right. I actually think Afghanistan may be next. We have both, Pompeo and, Nicholson saying that maybe, we're going to have peace talks with the Taliban. So, that actually might be the next stop on the Trump peace train. Who would have ever thought we'd be talking about that? Well, Will, do you have anything final to say? I mean, do you think that Vladimir Putin will be moving into the White House as Hillary Clinton and I guess the rest of the Democrats think that, this was Trump's acknowledgement that Vladimir Putin is actually the current sitting president of the United States of America?
I think we all better learn Russian real fast.
Yeah, I heard some lady at the gas station say that this morning, that she's going to start teaching her daughter Russian.
Hey, it's a beautiful language. She should teach her daughter Russian.
All right, well, I guess that's where we'll wrap up the show for today. If anybody wants to check out your work, Will, or find you anywhere, tell them where to go.
Sure. As Kyle mentioned at the beginning of the show, you can find my writing at antiwar.com. You can find me at the Libertarian Institute in the featured articles section, and you can find me at Consortium News lately as well. On Twitter, you can find me at WKP ANCAP, ANCAP, and if you want to contribute to what I do, you can find me at patreon.com/WKP Journalist.
All right, Will, thanks so much for coming on the show. If anybody wants to share today's show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, immersionnews.com is my personal news website. You check out my Twitter at KYAAALE. Facebook page is Libertarian Union, and the Patreon page, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. And there is going to be some bonus content from the last time that me and Will Porter talked. So hope you all enjoy that, and go donate to me and Will and listen to our good bonus content.
Thanks, Kyle.